Well, welcome to Silver Lining for Learning. This is episode 99. And next week is our big celebratory episode 100. But I'm very excited about this week. I have known Barbara Means and Jeremy Roschelle, who will join us shortly, both of them since the 1980s. And they have certainly influenced my ideas throughout that period of time. And both of them have been referred to in prior shows, the 98 prior shows, because, for example, Barbara, we've talked about expanding evidence and, getting beyond the RCT as the measure of truth in research. And we've also talked a lot about scale and translation research and other forms of thinking about how to scale things. And I was very excited when you and Jeremy said that you wanted to talk about how you actually make visions happen, because we've heard a lot of visions on this show. And in fact, sometimes we've said to people, your vision is like the other 10 reports that were published in the last 3 years. So I don't think that the insight is having the vision. The insight is how you actually make it occur. So Barbara, tell us just a little bit about your background and the trajectory of your career.
Well, I'll try to give a little orientation, Chris, and thank you first for the opportunity to be part of this 99th episode. That's terrific. I went to college in psychology, earned a bachelor's degree. And during that process, I actually became very interested in how children of different ages learn. And I also became aware of some of the real inequities in our school system. I remember reading about the Brown versus Board of Education case and how psychology research on the self-perceptions of young Black children entered into that landmark Supreme Court case requiring integration of schools. And that really impressed me that first, that research could have this great public policy impact and that it could actually do something good for the world. At the same time, I was also fascinated with the analytic part of research. So I ended up going to UC Berkeley for my doctoral studies. And while there, I was trained in what was typical at the time. It was around cognitive development and education. But our research, our careful methods we learned, were pretty much the kind of thing you would do in a laboratory. We actually went to schools, but we pulled children out of the class one by one. And we had a very standard kind of experimental protocol. I actually had children remembering paired associates of different words and lists. And that was what I did for 4 years at Berkeley. I enjoyed the research. I enjoyed learning how to do it and how to write it up. But it seemed a long way from actually changing the kind of education that people got in our public school systems. Nevertheless, I kind of had a meandering pathway, as many people do. I spent some time teaching at UMBC. That was after a postdoc at Rockefeller University, where I worked with Mike Cole and his comparative cognition group. And during that time, I felt a kind of tension between what I wanted to do with real classrooms in the real world and my training in more experimental methods. Meanwhile, the field was moving more and more to doing work actually in classroom settings. And so that became a better, a better environment in which to do the kind of work I wanted to do. So I actually started doing work early on in college settings, in K-12, and with the military services. So one of the things that really got me into technology was working with the Air Force on how to design intelligent tutoring systems for Air Force technicians who were doing maintenance on fighter planes. And when I saw what people could do with the right kind of experience supported by technology, I was hooked. And I started thinking, well, how do we bring this to children in the public school system? And thus, then I had a long experience, many years at SRI, where I founded the Center for Technology and Learning. And we brought in this young then researcher, Jeremy Roschelle, and and really doing applied research that had to do with working with use of technology in schools and classrooms in the real world. But nevertheless, you were still at some remove from it because we were writing evaluations or research studies, which is fine, except it doesn't necessarily get put into practice in the way you'd like to. And wanting to really be closer to practice is what brought us to Digital Promise. And also our topic for today is what kind of research do you do if you really want to affect what happens in classrooms?
Now, Barbara was giving us a sketch of her intellectual progression across time, and Jeremy, I'll ask you to do the same. But Barbara, you're a little modest because you didn't mention the 2010 National Educational Technology Plan, which was, your leadership in that. That document was very influential, and I think in part because, as you said, people aren't going to go to scholarly journals, but the plan made the ideas and the evidence accessible to people, I believe.
That was certainly our intention, and I think it was a real change in the way technology was presented from a federal agency. And of course, Chris, you were on the board, the technical working group that we assembled to help make that a intellectually rigorous document while also being very accessible to policymakers and practitioners.
Yeah, we had a great time. So Jeremy, tell us about your path.
Yeah, Chris, it's great to be here. Well, I wasn't accepted to the place where you work, that shiny place called Harvard, but I was accepted to a place a little ways down the street, a little known place called MIT. And I wanted to study physics. And I could not stand the way they taught physics. I thought physics was just a really cool, interesting, fascinating subject. And the way they taught it was there was this huge lecture room. It had 9 sliding blackboards, and the professor would start on blackboard number 1, and class was over when he had filled blackboard number 9. And there was no conceptual understanding to be found. It was grinding through equations. So I left physics and headed over to computer science and found, hey, you can teach complicated subjects better. And I eventually drifted towards the Logo Lab at MIT, which had a bunch of people really thinking about what you could do with technology to change learning. And so I won't make it a really long story, but it was really the frustration with how a subject I loved was being taught, and the realization that we can do better with technology. We can help people really understand the concepts and not just these piles and piles of algebra. So that's motivated me ever since. I would say a key part of my trajectory since then is really both wanting to, I was drawn to the learning sciences because I really want to understand how things work. Maybe that's the physicist's tendency to want to know the mechanisms of things. And so I studied small numbers of students to understand that, but then I also really wanted to have an impact. And so that got me thinking about, well, how do you scale things up? What does scale up look like? And I know that's a topic that you're also super interested in, Chris. So my trajectory has been like a tension between those two things. How do we really understand learning? And once we do, and we can improve it with technology, well, how do we work on scaling that up?
And Jeremy, I know that you have a background with this because I was peripherally involved with the evolution of a math curriculum called SimCalc.
Mhm.
And you did extensive studies of SimCalc at scale. For at least a period of time, it really achieved some success and scale. So, Kurt, Punya, do you have a question you want to throw in as a way to get us started?
Sure, would love to. So, Jeremy, I also wanted to be a physicist. That was my goal starting out. But in India, if you are good in science and math, you either go engineering or medicine. And I ended up in engineering school, and I described those 4 years as sort of a black hole. Came out the other end, and that's how sort of the interest in education came to me, because I was like, okay, I've got to do something different in changing that. And that's when I first started working with technology. So it's just interesting to hear that similarity. But I would, given the, and Barbara, what you talked about, sort of the move from, sort of the studying these words and memory and so on, which is sort of my background with educational psychology as well. How do you see this sort of shift in this research? Because there's a question from one of our regular listeners, Gerald Fusso, which I think is really at the heart of what we are trying to talk about here, which is that, yes, there is impeccable research being done, but for some reason, it doesn't really impact what happens in actual classrooms and so on. So if you can speak from your personal experience, and either of you can go first and lead us through that, about what kinds of research, because, Chris, you mentioned in the beginning, that a certain kind of research is regarded as being the gold standard. And though it might work in certain contexts, it's not clear to me that it works in education as well. And so what kinds of models of research and then research dissemination do you think we need to be thinking about? I think we'll come to the question of scale a little later, but let's look at this idea of what kind of research should we be pursuing, and how do we make sure that it's disseminated in ways that can have actual impact in the classrooms and learning environments that we seek to have. And either of you can go first.
Maybe I'll start, and then Jeremy can chime in with his perspective. In my view, the problem is one of not appreciating how complex education is, how many different kinds of variables are involved. There are the kinds of learners, there's the kind of instructor, there's the organization you're in, the constraints of that environment, and of course the subject matter differs. When you put all that in, you have this immensely complex system, and the outcomes are not easily predicted. Even if one looks at the very best research, it's not likely to match on all of those system variables, which can have a very big effect on what happens. And so I think when you think about educators who are not primarily tasked with research usage, their primary task is to bring about learning in their classroom, they're unlikely to find in any easy way the answer to the real questions that they have that they're facing every day. And so going to journals, even going to podcasts, they might get inspired, but it doesn't tell you how to implement something in your particular classroom, in your particular setting. So what I think works better, that we've been moving toward, is trying to do research that is well-designed, well-executed research, but doing it with practitioners. And then we're forced as researchers to take into account the many contextual variables they have to deal with. And they're partnering with us on a longer-term basis so that they understand what the research means and what it doesn't mean. So that problem of interpretation that often gets in the way is really addressed over a long period of time and in a collaborative way.
Yeah. I'd love to pick up on the theme of systems and complexity for just a bit and run with that, and I agree completely. Barbara and I have come to Digital Promise both because we're really dedicated to doing research with practitioners, and it's a great place to do that. But I also think our orientation to what research is it can be a little bit different. And so I'm going to describe 4 corners of my screen here for a second. I'm going to say, there's some folks for whom research, I'll put them over here, right there in this corner. It's about a theory. Maybe self-regulation is the theory that you have. And this is a really great theory. And you think your theory, if you just can get into schools, is going to change everything. And the problem with that is what changes schools is never just one theory. You have to put things together. And then there's people, I'm going to put them over in this corner, who think they've got a method, maybe randomized controlled trials. We went through a big wave of that. Well, if we only did randomized controlled trials, that would change education. Well, it kind of misunderstands the complexity of the system. And then there's actual systems builders who make some progress on things. Those are people who build complex applications and figure out how to turn them into a curriculum. I respect them a ton. And I think that's one way to make progress. But I think I'm over here in this other corner. And I'm going to call that corner building models of the complexity of educational systems. And I think what Barbara and I and our team both do is we care about factors at all different levels. And when we talk to practitioners, we're trying to elicit these different factors. And yes, we have theories, and yes, we have methods, and yes, we have systems, but we're trying to understand over time what the most important factors are that can lead to system change, the manipulable, the leverageable factors, and how they relate to each other, and to try to understand if it's not working, what's the next factor we have to put into our model. And so I think it's that modeling perspective you have to make a change in education, that it is complex, and you're going to have to build an understanding of that complexity to get anywhere.
Thank you. I'm reminded of there's this fabulous debate between two Nobel laureates, Abhijit Banerjee and Angus Deaton. If people who are watching, if they haven't seen it, just look it up. And it is one of the best sort of debates I've seen, where Abhijit Banerjee, being who he is arguing for RCTs, and Angus Deaton comes at this from this angry birds metaphor of research. And it's just a fabulous, because, it's not that, you have to end up on one end or the other, but it's just a great example of how complex these things are. And it's always surprising to me, especially when I look at a lot of the motivation research and so on, where you start working with these really intricate variables, which you can control in a lab environment. And then you walk into a classroom, and then you're in front of 25 wiggling, diverse, in every dimension possible. And if Zhao would be here, I think he would talk about sort of the jagged profile of each learner, and that the nobody is really an average. And just the noise in the system can just wreak havoc with any, those micro variables that you are tweaking. So there was a question from Gerald, which was a follow-up, is like, how do we, who should translate the research into practice, is this where a systems leader need to step in? And I wonder if you have been doing any work with, because as you speak of systems, with the leadership with districts and schools, and how that sort of is part of the knowledge transfer or, implementation process. And then I think Kurt would go next after that.
Sure. I am torn between trying to reflect on the RCT question and then talk about the leadership. Let me just say, for the RCT question, randomized controlled trials, I think, can work very well for something that's quite discrete and relatively short term. And it can help you understand the impact of this one thing that's happening under a fairly controlled environment, which almost always means it has to be pretty short term and pretty confined. And that's fine for answering some little questions like, is it better to have, I don't know, two choices or one choice when you're trying to figure out what your next learning path is going to be, or something of that ilk. But the questions we really care about, which have to do a bit with building capacity over years or over a whole course or a year of school at least, those questions are much more complicated. And you can't just add up all the little bits and get the answer. So I think partly the method needs to match what the nature of the question and the context is, which we don't always do.
Yeah, maybe I can should I pick up the leadership part, or did you have more you want to say, Barbara?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the joys of being at where we work, Digital Promise. We have a League of Innovative Schools. It has over 100 districts, and the members of the league are school superintendents. And so we really work very closely with school superintendents, and doing so can really change your perspective on the whole thing. And I'll give you one simple example that was shocking to me. You know, as Chris mentioned, I've worked a lot on technologies for math learning. And it's the general attitude of researchers in that field that I'm going to work on this one new thing and show how great it is, my RCT or whatever, will show it really works. And then my one thing will be adopted. Well, now let's go and talk to the school leaders. And their mindset is, I have 400 products floating for math floating out in my district. You want me to use 401? My problem is I have 400. I don't know which of these things are any good. And I don't know which ones are theory-based. And I don't know how to spread the ones that really make it, find the ones that really make a difference and consolidate on them. So my own attitude has shifted a lot from trying to understand, you know, how to put one new thing in, to understanding what resources are in place and what's standing in the way of a learning sciences-based approach to using that resource. And how can we study that problem? Because schools actually have a lot of technological resources. And it's not like 30 years ago where they didn't have them and we had to stick them in. Now they have them, they're overwhelmed by them. How do we turn this chaos into progress? And there's a lot of really great research to do, but for the field, it's a big pivot because the field has been built around, I will make my mark and get published and get tenure and get in journals because I've invented one new thing, right?
Mhm.
And so it's a big pivot for the field. I don't know how we do it for the field of research exactly. I mean, later I'll have some ideas. I know something about how we do it, but I do think it's really hard. I think we've grown up as a field, and then all of a sudden we've shifted from scarcity of technologies for math, computer science, science to abundance. And we haven't studied how to solve problems of teaching and learning in situations of abundance and situations of being overloaded and being overwhelmed with how many technologies there are.
So I'll just add one quick comment. Thank you for that, Barbara and Jeremy. So when I served on the school board back in Michigan, when I was at Michigan State, so I served on the school board for a couple of years. It was really interesting. I tried to get faculty experts from the College of Education there, and they would always end with something like, we need more research, while there would be a snake oil salesman over there pitching their product, saying this is going to solve all your reading problems, blah, 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 irrespective of whether there was research behind it or not, or some study that existed. And I think that's part of the challenge as well, which is that as academics, we sort of hesitate to take a strong stand on something, even though we might be an expert in that domain. And at that point, saying to the best of our knowledge, this is what we should do, there is a hesitancy to doing that as well, which I think gets in the way of the impact of the work. But I know Kurt has some questions coming up. So Kurt, on to you.
Yeah, mine will get at impact when I get to the actual questions. And that's why I wanted to delay this a little bit, because it's more for the end of the show maybe. But I want to say to Jeremy, first off, that if you want to see chalkboards being filled, you should have been an accounting major. Cost accounting, consolidations, tax, you name it, doesn't matter what it was. They filled up a lot of boards, and I was very bored with them filling up the boards. So the first thing I did when I became a faculty at West Virginia University was write a paper on how the accounting curriculum could change to be more active and engaging and so forth, and use a consultative model. That only took me 7 years to publish in the top education journal in accounting, the Journal of Accounting Ed. It sat on the editor's desk for 2.5 years, then on my desk for a year or two, then back on his desk for a year or two, but I got out. But first, I want to thank both of you for your leadership. And, you've tackled the big problems, or many big problems, not all the big problems, but you've tackled many big problems, and you've organized folks, you've organized people to think about huge issues, like what you did at National Geographic about 10 years ago. We had that cyber learning seminar there, the whole day. That was fascinating, But, my students are reading from people like you in awe, and junior people are, and mid-career people are. And so I want to get to that. first, just for our 99th show, to have both of you on, it's really a treat and a delight, and to have people who have authored so many important reports in the field. I really am delighted you could be here, and I'm sit back and I'm learning, and our audience will learn, and those watching the recording later will be assigning it to their students. So, but this morning, I got an article sent to me on AI in education from a colleague of mine at Wayne State. And I looked at it and I said, I need to put this in my monster syllabus class. I have 112-page syllabus on emerging learning technologies. And underneath the article was this article. I put this article on week 14. I said, here's an article, AI and the Future of Learning, Expert Panel Report. Chris is on that, and Suzanne LaJoy is on that, and Cindy Helm-Silver, and you name it. But Jeremy, you're in charge of that. You're the first author of this one. And the other article that's in the monster syllabus is the one by Barbara, the evaluation of evidence-based practices in online learning and meta-analysis and review of online learning studies. And we had the early version, we've had the later version. I don't know if you have a third version or not, or if you're working on it, let us know. But, I'd like each of you to take a stab at talking about the impact that your reports have had, in particular, Barbara, that report I mentioned, but also this expert roundtable that you had, Jeremy, and other things that you've had. What have those been highly impactful in your mind, and what reports have you done that have had an impact? And for people who are mid-career folks or maybe junior folks, what advice would you give them so that they can start to think about making an impact with their research, with their scholarly endeavors and so forth? What things have been the successful principles or guiding, some guiding tips that you could give to others so that they can in turn keep pushing the field forward? I'll let either one of you start first.
I'll take a crack at that. I do think that that particular meta-analysis is probably my most often cited piece.
I've cited it many times.
Well, I think one of the reasons it's cited, because we did find the equivalence of learning online and learning face-to-face when you looked at the body of literature available at that time as a whole, and blended learning had better outcomes than purely face-to-face learning. I know one reason it gets cited a lot is it turns out to be useful when people are writing research proposals. I think so, certainly proposals, but also within organizations. I have met many people, for example, in centers for teaching and learning in colleges who say, oh, I cite your work all the time. We didn't know, of course, when we set out to do the work, what we would find from the meta-analysis. If it had found that that learning online was significantly poorer than learning face-to-face, I'm not sure it would have been cited. Well, maybe not quite as much, but I suppose it still feeds into decision-making, which is how I would answer the second part of your question in terms of advice for young researchers or mid-career researchers. My own path has been trying to find things that people care about, that they're going to make decisions based on, and trying to do research in those areas. And of course, the way to find that out is to talk to people. So talking to educators, talking to education policymakers, and find out what questions they have that they want to answer through research. And then, of course, do the best job you can. It actually was much more daunting doing that lit review, and my colleagues who worked on it, Yuki Toyama and Robert Murphy, spent hours and hours screening through and coding all the studies in order to be able to have the corpus that we could then summarize. So I would say find a problem that's worth addressing, and know from talking to people that it's something they really want the answer to, and then just put your all into it.
I was working with Bob Wisher at the Army Research Institute about a decade, well, 2 decades ago now. Time flies when you're having fun. And he and I did a meta-analysis around 2003 of the online learning literature, and it was not that extensive. And we could only find maybe 35 studies that were comparable at the time, you know. And we had a crew that would do the data analysis like you did as well. But it was our first attempt at what was happening. And so when you had your report come out 7 years or so later, it was really a delight to see the extent to which the field grew and how many studies you actually could include. I forget how many you had in the first one. How many did you have in the first and second studies? Do you remember offhand?
I think it was around, I want to say 99, something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been tracking the field for a couple of decades, and because of that, this makes your report particularly important, impactful, and seminal in the case of my class that I'm teaching right now, and having people try and summarize and wrap their heads around what the field does say. So I thank you for that. So Jeremy, you want to take a stab at that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the answer that Barbara gave, because, picking the right problem definitely matters, picking a problem that people really care about. And then what you often find when you do pick a problem that is one that people care about is that the research or your skills and your knowledge and your research isn't dead on for that. And what you're going to need to do is pull people together who have expertise different than your own. And so everything I've done that's ever made a big impact has been done collaboratively. And it's by, people picking people that, I'm not the smartest person in the room. These people are coming together and we're synergizing our ideas, and we're all trying to work this really hard problem. And so getting good at collaboration, and it's something you can do. My first great collaboration was with Stephanie Teasley, and it was at the very beginning of my career, and resulted in work that still is my most cited paper. And so you don't have to be super senior. You can start collaborating in graduate school. Just find that really hard problem that interests you and interests somebody in an adjacent field, and that needs both of you to solve it. Right. And then with SimCalc, I just had to keep adding people, because that modeling thing I was talking about, all these factors, well, I wasn't an expert in all those factors. So I just kept bringing more people into the team that were experts in each factor until we could actually get something that really worked, because we had understood the system. Anyway, that's my answers, the art of collaboration, if you're going to really make an impact.
I think I'll come back to that point later in the show about collaboration. This is important to me as well. But I will say the collaboration was alive and well when I was a first-year professor 30 years ago, 33 years ago. And visiting the MIT Media Lab and talking to Ricky Goldman-Siegel and others about the new book, Constructionism, and picking that up at AERA when it was held in Boston back then, 1990, I think. Just chatting with the folks in the lab. They were all doing collaborative projects or getting feedback from others in the lab. They weren't solitary in their work. They weren't doing so. They were working and talking and discussing key issues in the field, and that's what pushed us ahead. So yeah, that was real inspiring to me. I don't know if you were working with Ricky or others Jeremy, when you were there. Yeah, it was just such a fabulous team you guys had. So Chris is going to take us to the next point here.
So I want to go back to the 2010 National EdTech Plan, and Jeremy, your excellent point about making models of educational systems so that you understand what it takes to really not only to improve a system, but potentially to transform a system. And the 2010 EdTech Plan was the first EdTech plan that didn't say, let's take the current system and make it better by adding EdTech, doing things better. It was the first plan that said, let's do better things. and let's transform education and really orient it towards the challenges of the 21st century instead of, in Harvard's case, the 16th century. And but that and I thought the model was really good because there was a section that was about assessment, and we know that assessment is a crucial part of the system. There was a section about capacity building and educators, and we know that capacity building was part of it, and so on. And then since then, I think that model got adopted by different groups, and we saw more systemic analyses of technology in education. So Barry Fishman and I co-authored a chapter for the Handbook of Research on Teaching that was about teaching with technology. And again, it was a very systemic analogy that started with, well, what outcomes do we want from education? And then if these are the outcomes that we want, these are the teaching methods we need to use. And then these are the teaching methods we need to use, and these are the technologies we need to use to support those, and sort of walked people through that. And I think that in recent reports that we've seen from OECD and from similar kind of major nonprofits, UNESCO, the vision has been pretty good. The vision has been kind of consistent from 2010 until now about what kids really need to be prepared for the future. Unfortunately, since the 2010 EdTech plan, those reports haven't really had much of a plan connected with them. They've been, 90% vision, and then there's a little section at the end that says, wow, let's make this happen now, and why don't you all get involved in doing it? And yet I think that it's the plan that really makes the difference. And I'm curious, as you work with the digital promise districts, where you're not having to sell the ideas because they get it, but you are trying to create incremental or perhaps transformational change with them. How do you get them taking the right actions as opposed to just being on the same page as to where to go?
I can describe our research practice partnership with colleges. It's a little different than districts. I don't know if you have a district example, Jeremy, you want to use?
Sure, I can do a district example, but we can both go whatever order. Do you want me to go first with the district one?
Sure.
Sure. One of the first new projects I started when I came to Digital Promise with a colleague named Quinn Burke, and we've since had lots of wonderful colleagues work on that project, was about integrating computational thinking into whole districts. The frustration driving the project was one districts readily recognize. They have a suite of electives, they have days of code, but when they get to high school, the population taking computer science is not representative of the population of their school. And the solution they recognized as well was we have to start earlier. We can't wait to high school to fix this problem. So what Digital Promise has found success with to help districts work problems like that, and the nature of the problem there is, how do you make a pathway for every child in a district so that they get consistent experience that grows for them? And computational thinking isn't left to a day of code or an after-school robotics club, but it's part of the core. Well, that's a thorny problem for a district. You need a pathway to get at it. What we've had success with is building planning toolkits, essentially, or planning frameworks with modules that enable a district to work through the planning challenge they're up against, the structural challenge they're up against. And the district leaders can do all of this, but it gets a lot easier for them if a toolkit gives them, first you do this, then you do this, and here's some tear out sheets in essence that, if part of this is inventorying everything going on in your district with computer science, how do you do the inventory? Well, there's probably lots of ways to do it, but give us one and let's get started on it. It makes it easier. So I think that's one of the key things that Digital Promise does well, is shifting the frame from, use this way to use Scratch, use code.org, use this, use all of it is our point of view. What we want to do is give you a planning toolkit so you can make it coherent and make it cumulative and make it consistent, make it equitable for all your students. So it's a shift in attitude, again, from I've got one thing and I want to insert it into your school to you've got lots of things, but they're not working to get you towards your goal. Okay, over to you, Barbara.
So my college example is similar in the shift of ownership of the work and the different role that researchers take. So we're doing a research practice partnership with 5 colleges around equity and digital learning. So our role was conceiving of this as a problem area. We know that if you look at the large introductory courses that people take in college, I mean, 2 of the participants today had horror stories from their undergraduate years, and that's still going on. And it's particularly hard for students who come with less preparation, who have holes in their preparation, who may not be sure they really belong in college. And we know that if you look at the course credit earning, that is success rates, getting a C or better in a course so you get a credit, we know that there are gaps between different groups of students, whether it's by income level or whether it's by race, ethnicity, in the percentage of students from that group who tend to succeed in a course. So if we can improve the quality of teaching and learning in those early courses, then underserved groups of students will have a better chance of succeeding in the course, earning more college credits, and deciding it's worth continuing in college rather than leaving, which again, we have a lot of data showing there are gaps there. So we set forth the notion that we needed to combine some of the power you can get from digital learning systems with a real approach to equity-minded pedagogical approaches and creating a positive class climate that's very inclusive of all kinds of students and the kinds that are in your particular classes. And our role was to put that out there as a statement of a problem, and not that we had a solution, but that we wanted to work in partnership with colleges, bring together colleges and researchers and technical assistance providers to work together on this problem. And we were seeking particularly minority serving institutions. We got more colleges asking to work with us than we were able to work with. We decided we felt we could support 5. We couldn't do any more. We had originally planned on just 4, but we couldn't turn down the 5 that came to us. And they each had their own version. They each had their own course or courses, from 1 to 5 courses they wanted to work on. They each had their own framing of the particular use of digital learning they wanted to do, and also the kinds of students that they were concerned with. But we brought certain research tools in. We surveyed all the students and we showed them the data disaggregated by student group. We also pulled data that was available to them that was in their institutional research office with course grades. We disaggregated it by student race, ethnicity, and income level. They got some surprises about where the gaps were in their course. And we've been working together for about 1.5 years now. They make the decisions of what they do in their course, but we provide facilitation for cross-college activities. We bring in experts to talk to them, and we bring in a measurement system and an idea of continuous improvement. And so that's a very different kind of role. It's clearly collaborative. We bring in some resources from our knowledge of prior research and what is going on in other places. But they're the decision makers and we're collaborators.
So there's a question, Jeremy, for you from Lydia, who's one of our regular listeners. Are there examples of the planning toolkits that you mentioned? If there are, if you could just drop a link in the chat, I can put it in the YouTube chat as well.
Yeah, I'll send that along. I'll send you the CT Pathways Toolkit as an example.
Perfect. And in fact, I can update the website as well so that it's archived on the website.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to follow up with a question from Gerald, and I'm going to try and channel Yang Zhao a little bit, even though he's not here, because he has a thread of questioning, I think, that he brings to all of our guests. So Gerald's question was that we've been talking about the competencies needed for the dynamic future youth who will be entering, creating, but we have seen little change in what we are doing in schools, why, and what needs to change. And the channeling of Zhao will be of the form that Zhao has been arguing on this show and in his books and other places, that we live in a world where learning can actually be very open, and that it can be driven by learners themselves, that there can be curricula or ways of studying that the learners decide for themselves, which I think sort of ties in with Gerald's question as well. So his argument, so Zhao's argument would be something like that: we shouldn't be thinking about how to fix schools. We need to be creating systems which allow individuals to take charge of their own learning. So I wonder, so in this sort of Gerald's question as well as Zhao's, I think basically points to this thing of how are we training students for this future that we don't know what it will be, that they can become self-directed learners, and so on. So either of you can go first on that. So I don't know, Chris, Kurt, if you think I channeled Zhao properly, but I think he would have been a little more extreme than me. But but that's Zhao, so that's okay. Anybody wants to go ahead?
Well, I guess I might say that I think we have a tendency to look for really big, dramatic changes. And especially when a new technology comes in, we see this, but it happens with other things too. We expect a big, dramatic change. It doesn't happen. And then sometimes we miss the smaller, more incremental change, but it accumulates over time and really makes a difference. I actually think that COVID, although it did many harmful things in education, did provide an impetus for many more students to take charge of their own learning. In some cases, it was in frustration, but where they turned to a variety of different kinds of learning resources. And you hear more students talking about that. I didn't understand the way my teacher explained it, so I found these other resources. This didn't work for me, so I tried that. And I actually think that at least among older students, that a lot of this happened in the last 2 years, and that incrementally that is going to serve them well.
I guess one thought Gerald's question brings up for me is it begets another question. And that is, well, I think where we went wrong a little bit. He was asking, where did we go wrong? I think there was a wave of taking 21st century competencies, collaboration, cooperation, this, that, the other, creativity, and bringing in technology and then saying, well, if you could do PowerPoint instead of doing your regular assignments, now you were doing 21st century skills. That's a little bit of a caricature, but it happened that way in a lot of places. And so the serious question, and I get this question from my dissertation advisor, Andy DeSessa, is do these competencies that we want, like collaboration, are they general competencies, or do they always develop by going deep in a discipline? Can you learn collaboration on its own? Or do you become a great collaborator by becoming a great collaborator in physics, or a great collaborator in needlework, needlepoint, or a great collaborator in something? And I tend to fall in the latter camp, that it's by going deep in a subject matter you care about that you develop those skills, and they don't exist in general. They're part of a community of practice, they're part of a literacy, and you have to grow into that community and that practice I would emphasize the social or community point, that the way the question was phrased can make it sound like every learner is going out into the frontier of the United States in those days when you could just go out and they're making their own way. And we know from studies of how the West developed that it was actually incredibly social and supported by institutions. It didn't happen by individuals. So I tend to go for the interest-driven and go deep in something you really care about point, but I tend to respect the role of institutions and society and social things in enabling anyone to do that and in doing it with equity. So I guess sort of a mixed answer to that.
No, that's great, Jeremy, because Zhao and I have this discussion all the time, because there's this whole controversy even within the creativity field, whether creativity is this general attribute that works across, or creativity is actually deeply rooted in disciplinary practices and so on, right? And I think that, and then I think the layer that you add to it about the institutional/social aspect of it is the piece that I also struggle with. So I can see the ideal world that Zhao keeps thinking about, but it seems to me that there have to be systemic institutional structures that have to be designed, and then otherwise it doesn't go to scale. So I think that brings us to the issue of scale. And I know I'm looking at the time and we are at 9 minutes, I think. Either of you want to talk about that, or Kurt, Chris, if you have any questions, because to us, I think to me personally, this idea of how do we take ideas which work in one context, but then translate them, transfer them in ways that I at some level, I don't like the word scale, because it means that it's a replication, it's cloning, as opposed to when, evolutionarily, it's actually growth in contextual growth, in that way. So I don't know if you guys want to speak to that, because that's, I think, an important topic for us to talk about.
So how about a couple of minutes on scale, and then I'll jump in with the final questions for them. If you can answer scalability.
Right.
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you, briefly, what I'm putting a lot of energy into these days, and it has a bit of research leadership in it, but it's thinking a little bit differently about things. It relates to the comment that Barbara made. The pandemic was horrible, but did some wonderful things too. One of the things it did is everyone's using educational technology platforms now. And these platforms, the vendors and developers, they're not all vendors, some of them are nonprofits, have an interest in opening these platforms so that others could come in and do improvement studies in the platform. And there's a lot of safeguards that need to be put in place to make that work. But what I like about it as a movement is it's a different view of tech transfer. Normally, we think we do research over here, and now that we've gotten our result, we're going to have to figure out how to get it over there into the platform that kids actually use. And I want to move the researcher, not the solution. I want the researchers to stop building their own unique toy things. And I want them to talk to platform vendors who are doing something that's close to what they already believe is the right thing, and that are already serving 100,000 or 1 million students. And let's move the innovation and the research process to where the kids are. And that way, if we actually make a change that's positive, we've already done it in the place where the scale is. And so that's the big thing I'm working on, is how do we do that? How do we shift the focus of research from a waterfall model where you do it smaller and a little bit bigger and then a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, to a model where you do the research where the action is?
And I think one place we see that beginning to take hold is the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative in the U.S. Department of Defense, the Modernizing Learning Initiative, which is very much looking at how do you create a tech infrastructure, as you say, that makes research embedded and ongoing and engineers learning, rather than research as something outside and then you find a way to add it as a secret sauce of some type.
Right. And I think this brings us back to the theme we talked about of collaboration. You don't set out to do your own thing by yourself and then see that scale. You're actually going to where there is an infrastructure and there are networks built around that infrastructure. And by working with them, the work that you do naturally is going to permeate that infrastructure, and there's a much more natural path for it building up. And I also think we need to get away from thinking of scale just as the sheer number of people who have touched something or clicked on something. We certainly know from Cynthia Coburn's work and others that understanding the depth of interaction and the way in which people are using things is so important. And I do see in the business world and the technology world, oftentimes there is, I think, way too much emphasis on just how many people have clicked on something for once, and too little emphasis on what difference did this experience make in the person's life.
So I have a quick question, maybe it's not quick, but I'll also mention that Barbara's authored or helped author or help with the How People Learn books 1 and 2. And so I wanted us to talk about, we have younger people in graduate school watching these episodes, and they might be interested in the evolution of CSCL, Jeremy. I was in the 1990s, I was part of that. I was doing collaborative writing research, and I did my first plenary at the first CSCL conference here in Bloomington, but I didn't stay with that. Okay, so, and I was researching aspects in collaborative writing and all these things that were in 1990. I'm curious, you were there in 1990, and I was curious about how has the evolution of the field followed kind of the way you thought it would, or what new opportunities exist within the field of CSCL for graduate students now who might be thinking about a thesis, but maybe you don't have enough time. And Barbara, if you can make any kind of comment about the How People Learn book 1 or 2, and whether it's volume 3 is in the works or not. Either one of those you want to, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, the time is now for CSCL. So I think that, everyone experienced how bad trying to learn with the teacher as a hub and all the students as spokes can be. And what CSCL fundamentally is about is, how do students build knowledge together? That's the fundamental question. Well, everyone understands that that's a better way to learn now, because we've all done it the bad way. But the field of CSCL is in danger of just and people, I'm not unique in saying this, of painting itself into a corner with the smaller scale studies, or with just the focus on quantitative stuff. So everything we've been talking about on this episode is really wide open for people to go into. How do students build knowledge together with technology? But how do you model that as a system? How do you really make it work? That is still live, it's open, there's so many questions. And so I hope the next generation of scholars really goes for it.
Thanks.
I would echo that. I do think the combination of engagement and sense of community and doing things collaboratively and cooperatively is so important for learning and for also bringing equity to education, that I think that is a fundamental challenge for scholars to work on now.
Thanks. Punya, I think is going to introduce the next show.
All right. So let me try and pull up. So we have our 100th episode coming up next week, regular time, 5:30. And if you'd have asked us back when Zhao sent that first email out to a few of us saying that, would it be good to sort of meet and discuss what this pandemic means? And I think he had a sentence in there, something about, what if schools were closed for 1 year? What implications would that have? And I remember scoffing at that idea, because I thought this was going to be like a few weeks and then we'd be back to business as usual. But I guess not. And as we have seen, it has been transformational. And I think it was Chris who sort of nudged us towards, when we started the show, to call it Silver Lining for Learning, because for exactly the point, Barbara and Jeremy, that you said, that the COVID-19 crisis, as devastating as it has been, and let us not in any way minimize what it has done to our society and to the world around us. it has provided some opportunities to rethink education, to rethink what we can and should be doing in this space. Because for too long, I think we have assumed the ways that we have of doing things, whether you call it the hub and spokes model, Jeremy, as you said, or this one teacher, one classroom, or that we bus little people into one place and they sit in one room and then we make them walk to another room where they learn something else, that there are better ways of doing it, that we do have the knowledge to create different models, different approaches. And over these 199 episodes now, it has been, just speaking personally, eye-opening, inspirational, challenging for me. I bring this up every conversation I have because every episode I learn something new. It emphasizes something that I thought I knew, but adds nuance to it. It pushes me to think about things in ways that I had not possibly considered before. So it has been an amazing journey. So for the 100th episode, we are trying to do something special. There have been a set of people who have been very regular followers of our program. They are actively involved in the YouTube chat. They show up. I have no idea why every Saturday of their lives for the last 2 years, they spend an hour with us. We have become friends in some ways that one would never know. Some we knew before, some are absolutely new. So we will have a series of these people who have been a part of our journey for the past 2 years as guests. The structure of the program is actually pretty simple. We will start us off and then these individuals will join in. And the question conversation will be really about, if you take these individual shows and put them together, is there something greater than the sum of its parts that's emerging from this? And we look forward to seeing them. Many of them, we don't know what they look like because we've never actually seen them. So it's going to be a great show, and just really appreciate everybody who's been watching. And Barbara, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. So it's great to have you on the show today.